It was the second week after I had been discharged from the hospital, and the stitches on my side still pulled with every breath. The surgeon told me I needed rest, limited movement, someone to keep an eye on me in case the infection returned. My apartment, though humble and quiet, was 3 flights up with no elevator, and the plumbing had been temperamental for years. I had raised 2 daughters and worked for decades straight without a single vacation, longer than a Sunday afternoon. I had built a life out of sacrifice and silence, and now, at 73, the simple act of climbing stairs had become a negotiation with pain. So I did something I had never done before. I asked for help. I picked up the phone and called my daughter Elise. She didn't answer at first. A text came an hour later. "Hey Dad, sorry, just got out of a meeting. Everything okay?" I typed a reply, paused, deleted it, then typed again, slower this time, like someone rehearsing shame. "I was wondering if I could stay at your place for a little while, just until I get back on my feet." I added a smiley face, a ridiculous thing, as if softening the words could erase the weight of them. A few minutes passed, then another, then an hour, then 3, when she finally replied. It was short but not cold. "Let me ask Mark, my son-in-law." My daughter needed permission from the man I had once lent the down payment for their house. A man who still drove the SUV I had signed for when the dealership wouldn't approve him a loan. I stared at the message for longer than I cared to admit. The next morning, I received a call. Elise's voice was cheerful, slightly forced. "Hi, Dad. Mark said it's fine for you to stay in the guest room. Just a few ground rules, of course, for everyone's comfort." She mentioned something about quiet hours, shared spaces, making sure I cleaned up after myself. I said thank you, as if I hadn't noticed the way her tone changed when she spoke about comfort. I packed 1 small suitcase and a plastic grocery bag full of medications. I left a note for my neighbor in case any mail came. Then I locked the door behind me, perhaps for the last time. Their house was bigger than mine had ever been. 2 floors, a finished basement, a garden out back with lawn chairs and a fire pit they used once a year. I remembered the realtor's smile in the photo Elise had sent me when they bought it. "Our forever home," she had written in the caption. And I remembered writing a check that week, quietly, behind the scenes, so they wouldn't lose it to another buyer. I had never asked for it back. I had never even brought it up. Mark answered the door. He didn't smile. He wore gym shorts and held his phone in one hand, scrolling with his thumb even as he opened the door with the other. "Hey," he said. No welcome, no handshake, just a short sound meant to convey obligation. I stepped inside and felt the difference immediately. This wasn't my house, or even my daughter's house. It was a house I had paid for but was no longer welcoming. The guest room was small, with a mattress too thin for bones like mine. I placed my suitcase on the floor and sat slowly, feeling the protest in my joints. I could hear Elise in the kitchen, the clinking of plates, the hum of the refrigerator, her voice low as she asked their daughter to wash her hands before dinner. Their voices made me feel like an intruder in a museum exhibit, a man suspended in glass, once relevant, now just an artifact no one cared to dust. At dinner, I tried to make conversation. I asked how school was going for my granddaughter, whether Mark's new project at work was still in development. My words were answered with nods, shrugs, single syllables. Mark scrolled his phone. Elise smiled too much. My granddaughter looked at me the way children look at old photographs, curious but uncertain if they should care. That night, I couldn't sleep. The mattress squeaked with every breath I took. I stared at the ceiling and wondered when I had become this, a man with nowhere to go, whose presence caused inconvenience in a home he helped build. I remembered Elise's 5th birthday, when I spent a full week building her a dollhouse from scratch because I couldn't afford the plastic one she saw on TV. I remembered her crying when it broke, and how I stayed up all night fixing it so she wouldn't wake up sad. I remembered Mark the first time I met him. Nervous, young, unshaven. I gave him a suit for his job interview. I remembered him saying thank you, sir, with eyes that seemed to mean it. I remembered 100 little things they didn't. The next day, Mark knocked on the door of the guest room. I was reading the same page of a book I hadn't touched in years. He didn't come in. He just said, "Hey, just so you know, we have our routines here. Don't take this the wrong way, but this isn't a retirement home. Try not to get in the way, all right? Everyone's got their space." Then he left. I sat very still for a long time. Not angry, not sad, just awake. Something settled in me that moment. Something quiet and precise. I realized I didn't have to argue. Didn't have to explain. Didn't have to shout or cry or remind them who I was. I had something better. I had time, and I had patience. And I had a memory that never forgot who signed what, who paid for what, and what strings were still attached to everything they thought belonged to them. So I smiled. I went back to my book and turned the page for the first time in hours. Let them think I was defeated. Let them believe I had nowhere else to go. They had no idea the ground they stood on had been borrowed, and the lender had just remembered the due date. The morning after Mark's warning, I sat at the edge of the too-soft bed, feeling the ridges of my spine press into the thin fabric like tree roots against dry soil. My hip ached in that familiar way. It always did before rain, though the sky outside remained cruelly blue. I stared at the closed door, the chipped brass doorknob, the shallow dent in the white drywall where something must have hit it once. Perhaps a careless suitcase or the corner of a baby gate that had long since been taken down. I noticed these small imperfections, the way a prisoner memorizes every crack in his cell. A man with nowhere to go becomes intensely aware of his surroundings, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. Downstairs, I heard the sound of a blender, then voices. Elise's was sharp and clear, layered over her husband's deeper tone. I caught fragments. Just until the weekend. He's barely visible anyway, not like he's helping. I stayed in the room for hours that morning, reading headlines I didn't care about and watching the light on the curtain shift from gold to silver. No one called me for breakfast. No one asked if I was all right. It was only when I emerged to use the bathroom that I noticed something missing. My medications, the full set of plastic bottles lined up neatly in the zippered pouch, were no longer on the dresser where I had left them. My heart didn't quicken, not yet. I checked my bag, the bathroom, the nightstand. Nothing. When I asked Elise about it, she frowned and turned toward Mark. "Didn't you move them? You said you were going to organize the cabinets." Mark didn't even look up from his laptop. "They looked messy. I put them in a box somewhere," he said. "You shouldn't leave things lying around." I asked which box. He shrugged. "I'll look later." It wasn't the first time someone made me feel invisible, but it might have been the first time I was treated like clutter. A man's dignity doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes slowly, like rust at the edge of a blade, until the metal snaps without warning. I sat down at the kitchen table, empty and polished to a shine. My granddaughter came in and opened the fridge, barely glancing at me. I smiled at her and asked if she still liked those strawberry-flavored yogurts we used to buy together when she visited my place. She blinked. "I don't remember," she said, before grabbing a can of soda and vanishing into another room. I sat there, the sound of the refrigerator humming beside me, thinking about how little it takes for people to forget the hands that once carried them. Later that day, Mark passed by me in the hallway and paused just long enough to say, without a trace of irony, "You should really find a permanent solution. You know, we have lives. Elise has work. I've got things to handle. This isn't a long-term setup." He said it so casually, like he was discussing a guest towel that had overstayed its welcome. I nodded. I said, "Of course," though what I meant was something else entirely. I had no interest in staying another minute longer than I had to. I simply needed the pain in my side to ease enough to lift the box again, to drive a car, to get up without wincing. Every day I stayed was a day of reconnaissance. I learned the rhythms of the house, the subtle disconnections in their speech, the things Elise wouldn't say to me unless Mark was out of earshot. She had become a softer version of him, all courtesy without warmth. I wasn't her father anymore. I was a minor inconvenience wrapped in blood. It happened 3 days later, the moment that would carve itself into the base of my skull. I had walked out back, slowly, carefully, hoping the sun might grant my bones a moment of reprieve. I stood by the wooden fence I had paid to replace after a storm years earlier, the grain now aged gray with time. My granddaughter was sitting at the patio table, with headphones on, laughing at something on her phone. I looked at her and smiled. Then I heard the sliding door open behind me. Mark's voice was clipped, irritated. "Hey, you can't just wander around. I've got clients coming over later. Don't want them thinking this place is some kind of—" He didn't finish the sentence. But then, as he turned, half under his breath, he muttered it. "This isn't the damn asylum. Go back to your room. Go back to your room." The words weren't loud, but they hit harder than any scream. It was the tone, the indifference, the way he didn't even face me as he said it. The way my granddaughter didn't flinch, didn't even look up. I turned slowly and walked back inside, the soles of my shoes dragging slightly on the floor. I didn't cry. I didn't even tremble. But something inside me, something essential and old, closed like a vault door. That night, I sat in the dim light of the guest room and stared at the ceiling. I remembered every document, every form I had ever signed on their behalf. The health insurance policy I paid in full when Mark lost his job 2 winters ago. The car lease I had co-signed, still in my name, still with my credit. The company Elise worked for, which I had silently invested in during its infancy, pulling strings to land at the first round of contracts. And of course, the house itself, sitting atop a mortgage I had helped refinance 3 times. My name didn't live on the mailbox, but it lived in every corner of that structure, in the invisible scaffolding of their lives. I was not a burden. I was the foundation they had forgotten. So I made a list, quietly, thoroughly. I called lawyers I had known since I wore suits every day. I went through files with dates they'd long since stopped remembering. I didn't rush. I waited for the exact right moment, and it would come. Because men like Mark always assume the old man in the corner is harmless, until the floor beneath them begins to crack, and they realize too late who poured the concrete. Let them sleep easy tonight, I thought. Let them dream of permanence. Tomorrow, they'll wake up and realize just how temporary their comfort really was. Not out of spite, not out of anger, but because dignity, once torn, demands a reckoning. And I was ready to collect. That evening arrived draped in artificial warmth, the golden chandelier casting its soft glow over polished plates, the faint aroma of rosemary and garlic drifting from the oven, the clinking of glasses that masked the invisible cracks running through the walls of that house. I was seated at the far end of the table, not out of necessity but by design. Exiled to the periphery like a piece of old furniture no one had the courage to discard. My place was set, yes, but it felt more symbolic than sincere. Elise floated through the kitchen like a hostess playing the perfect daughter for some audience. That didn't exist. And Mark laughed too loud, too often, making jokes about cruise packages and weekend getaways too. Places with names that sounded like they belonged in a brochure rather than in a life with obligations. I listened, fork in hand, barely touching the roast that had clearly taken hours to prepare. Not because I wasn't hungry, but because each bite felt like a performance I didn't audition for. They toasted to promotions, talked about upgrading the SUV, debated the school district rankings, as if they were trading cards, never once acknowledging that the man who had once helped them sign the deed to that very house was now recovering from surgery in their guest room, like some lodger overstaying his welcome. The wine flowed freely for them, but I sipped water, not because I couldn't drink, but because I needed every ounce of clarity. Every remark passed over me like wind over stone, wearing, polishing, reshaping. It wasn't the absence of kindness that struck me. It was the studied effort to maintain the illusion that my presence did not alter their dynamic. Elise smiled at me in that tight, guilty way people do when they step over something fragile. Mark never once asked how my leg was healing, not even a glance. Instead, he spoke about renovations, joked about knocking down a wall to make room for a home gym. My chair, I realized, sat exactly where that wall would be, fitting in a cruel way, and I watched. That was my role now, apparently to observe the play as a ghost in the wings. But ghosts remember. I remembered the year Elise was born, how I worked 2 jobs and still made it to every doctor's appointment. I remembered her first car, the one I helped pick out, test drive, insure. I remembered Mark before the beard, nervous and grateful when he asked me for her hand in marriage. How I had said yes even when my gut whispered no. I remembered the down payment for this very house, my signature under theirs, the lender's handshake, the silent promise that I would always be the net beneath their ambitions. I remembered everything, and as I watched them talk about the future, that somehow didn't include me, I began to feel less like a burden and more like a witness to their selective amnesia. They didn't know, of course, that I still held the keys. Not literal keys, but the ones that unlock accounts, control policies, define ownership in the cold, inked world of contracts and clauses. As I pushed the food around on my plate and let their laughter wash over me, I wasn't sulking. I was calculating. Every dismissive glance, every sentence that deliberately avoided me, every future plan spoken aloud, as if I were already dead. These were numbers in an equation, not of revenge but of rebalancing, of restoring something elemental that had been taken without permission. Respect. After Deserta, rich tiramisu that Elise swore was homemade but tasted too precise, too sterile. I excused myself. Not a soul protested, not even a perfunctory, "You're leaving already?" They returned to their wine and playlists and open laptops, planning some summer trip to Santorini, while I climbed the stairs with deliberate slowness. In the guest room, surrounded by the sterile comfort of beige walls and neatly folded blankets, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the framed photo on the nightstand. It was of their wedding. I was in the background, blurry and smiling, holding Elise's veil as she adjusted her bouquet. Mark's face beamed front and center, confident, proud. I looked at that frozen moment and felt no nostalgia, only a quiet certainty that tomorrow wouldn't look like today. Not for them, and not for me. The house hummed below with sounds that no longer belonged to me. But the silence in my room was not empty. It was full of decisions not yet spoken, of signatures not yet revoked, of ties about to be unknotted. I lay back, closed my eyes, and let the memory of their laughter echo for the last time without reaction. Because soon, their world would lose its music and they wouldn't even know who turned the dial. The next morning greeted me not with the warmth of family or the fragrance of breakfast, but with the muted sound of dishes clinking downstairs and the low murmur of a television, left on for company, not for conversation. I sat in the armchair by the window in the guest room, bathed in that sterile morning light that always made everything appear more honest than it had any right to be. The birds outside chirped without a care, unaware that a quiet storm was forming inside me, not of rage but of clarity. As the pain in my leg throbbed with each shift in posture, it only reminded me more vividly of the price I had paid, of the surgeries endured, the sleepless nights alone, the long walks into banks, offices, and notaries to make sure they had the life they wanted. And now, seated in a room I helped pay for, in a house that stood not because of their sacrifice but mine. I recalled the detail that Mark, in all his arrogance and short memory, had clearly forgotten. He never read the contract. Not fully, not carefully, not with the eyes of someone who understood that generosity sometimes came with strings not tied out of malice, but out of necessity. Years ago, when Elise and Mark were flailing in the shallow end of adulthood, full of ambition but starved of credit history, it had been me who stepped in to co-sign the mortgage, to lend my name, my history, my trust. It had been me who sat with the bank manager, nodding at fine print and quietly securing the terms that would allow my daughter and her husband to buy a home in a neighborhood that spoke of success. And because I believed in the sanctity of trust, I had asked for little in return, just a clause, a minor clause, granting me authority over amendments, over the second lien, over the protections for any emergency that might one day render me vulnerable. I didn't imagine I would need it, but I had added it nonetheless, tucked among the pages like a life raft folded neatly beneath a bed that everyone hopes they'll never use. And then there was the company vehicle, the one Mark drove with pride, the one he parked diagonally in the driveway, as if to draw admiration from neighbors. He never knew that the lease was in my name, that the insurance, the maintenance, the registration had all looped back to the family business I founded, the very one he now boasted about running. It was a detail he never questioned, too busy posing as the architect of his own fortune to notice the scaffolding beneath him bore my name. I remembered the day they asked for the car, how Elise held my hand and said they couldn't afford a second one, how Mark nodded solemnly and said he'd work hard to pay it off. I had smiled then, not because I believed him, but because I loved her. That love had been the ink in my pen, the reason I kept signing, kept backing them even when their gratitude faded into routine. Downstairs, I heard his laugh again, sharp, empty, echoing against walls he thought were his. The television grew louder, tuned to some financial pundit rambling about market resilience, as if it applied to people like him. I closed my eyes and pictured the folder in my drawer at home, the one labeled contingencies. Inside were copies of every agreement, every power of attorney, every silent signature that tethered their comfort to my choices. The house, the car, even the health plan Mark boasted about to his co-workers, was under my group coverage. A courtesy, a gesture, a leash. They had mistaken my age for weakness, my silence for submission. But I hadn't forgotten how to navigate systems. I hadn't lost the instinct to protect what mattered. And now, sitting in that cold guest room, I began composing a different kind of itinerary, one not filled with destinations, but with decisions. I didn't feel anger. I felt precision, a clean, cold awareness that sometimes the only way to teach gratitude is to take away the illusion of independence. Mark would wake tomorrow expecting routine coffee made, car keys on the counter, a calendar filled with meetings he thought he controlled. But before that sun would rise again, things would move behind the scenes. Files would be opened, authorizations would be changed, rights would be revoked with the same quiet finality with which they were once granted. And when the dust settled, he wouldn't even know what hit him, only that the comfort he had mistaken for entitlement had vanished. And Elise, my daughter, who once clung to my thumb as a child afraid of the dark, she would have to choose, not between me and him. That choice had already been made. No, she would have to choose between the illusion she lived in and the reality she builded on. I would not raise my voice. I would not storm out. I would simply remove myself, and with me, the invisible scaffolding that had held them upright for so long. The contract was still valid, every word, every condition. And as I sat back in that chair, feeling the weight of years settle into my chest like a heavy coat, I realized I hadn't come to them as a burden. I had come as a test, and they had failed not with malice but with neglect. The kind of neglect that doesn't break glass but quietly corrodes the frame. They never read the fine print, but I did. And now, it was time for the balance to be restored. The next morning didn't begin with a word. No good morning. No knock on the door. Not even the courtesy of a glance. They moved around the house like I was a fixture, like I was some dated decoration, left out of place, tolerated but never acknowledged. I could smell the bacon, the coffee, the toasted bread all filtered through the crack under the door like a cruel hint of the life continuing without me. But I didn't crave their table anymore. I didn't want a seat among their empty smiles and hollow plans. I had my own agenda now, and it began not with confrontation, but with a quiet turning of a key in a lock I hadn't used in over a year. I'd asked Elise to drop me off in town that day. Told her I needed to go to the pharmacy for more post-surgery medication. She didn't ask questions, just handed me some bills from her wallet like a mother distracted by chores. Her eyes didn't even meet mine, and when I stepped out of the car and shut the door, I heard her sigh as she drove away. It was the last time I would need her for anything. The building hadn't changed. Same dull beige facade, same chipped paint near the door handle, same narrow hallway that smelled faintly of carpet glue and printer toner. But as I walked past the frosted glass of Linden and Associates, a surge of something old and sharp pulsed in my chest. Control. Memory. I was not a man discarded. I was a man with papers, and names, and numbers that carried weight when spoken aloud. James Linden opened the door himself, still wearing that same brown tie he always paired with his navy suits, and when he saw me, his face lit with the kind of respect I hadn't felt in months. "Murdoch Colton," he said, rising from behind his desk. "It's been a while." I nodded. I didn't have to explain anything. He had been my accountant for over 30 years, through my wife's illness, my retirement, the founding of the small company I built with my own hands. He knew me better than most of my family did. We sat across from each other, the old ledger between us replaced by dual monitors and a cup of decaf, and I began to speak not with rage, not with bitterness, but with the precision of a man taking inventory of his legacy. I laid out the house first, the mortgage documents, the lien addendum, the clause that gave me final say in the event of incapacitation or mistreatment. Then the car, the leased company vehicle tied to the small LLC I still technically owned. The company itself, still active on paper, still funneling a tidy sum monthly into the joint account I had opened for payroll disbursements, insurance deductions, and dividend allocations. My name was everywhere, not in lights but in ink. And then we moved on to the plan item by item, step by step, revoking access to the company account, canceling the secondary authorization on the business credit line, freezing the group health insurance connected to Mark's policy, reclaiming the vehicle under breach of company terms, and finally, issuing a notice to dissolve the payroll contract attached to his name, effective immediately. Everything would be done legally, with grace, but there would be no warning, no polite sit-down conversation to discuss it, just action. Irrefutable, quiet, and irreversible. James didn't ask why. He didn't need to. He simply nodded, took notes, filed documents into digital folders, and printed what needed signatures. And I signed without hesitation, without shaking hands, without a second thought. It felt not like vengeance, but like a necessary correction to a world that had forgotten the roots beneath its own tree. By the time we were done, it was almost noon. James stood to shake my hand again, and there was a pause of stillness between us that held more than just business. It held understanding. That some men grow old and disappear, others grow old and become invisible. But a few remember who they are, and they do not go quietly into the corners people try to push them into. I stepped out into the sun and felt the warmth not just on my skin, but deep in my chest, where indignation had turned into resolve. I wasn't angry anymore. I was awake. Elise texted me asking if I still needed a ride. I didn't respond. I walked instead, slowly, with a limp, but with the certainty of a man who had just begun to pull the threads of his own power back through his fingers. When I passed the florist, I bought a single white rose, not for sentimentality but for symbolism. The kind of flower you place not in celebration but at a burial. Something had died in that house, and what was about to happen wasn't revenge. It was a quiet dismantling of an illusion. When the clock struck midnight that Friday, a quiet wave of consequences began to ripple beneath the surface of their lives, precise and unannounced, like a fault line shifting under polished tile. Mark awoke, as he always did, around 6:30 a.m., groggy and half dreaming of weekend rest, already scrolling through his phone with that glazed, routine thumb swipe reserved for people whose lives run on autopilot. But something was wrong. He blinked, refreshed the banking app. Again. The usual numbers were absent: no payroll deposit, no scheduled payment pending. Just the solemn number 0, followed by a red message. Transaction failed. At first, I imagine he thought it was a glitch. Maybe the bank's server was down or there was some security flag. But as he tried to unlock the company credit card to pay for gas later that morning, it too declined. 3 times. The 3rd time, the machine at the pump spit the card back out with a metallic whine that might as well have been a laugh. He called Elise, but she didn't answer. She was probably already irritated with him for something small, as she often was lately. The tension between them had become a rhythm, and neither one had learned the steps. So he stormed into work, griping to a colleague about modern banks and how you couldn't trust systems anymore. But when he pulled into the company parking lot, a man in a navy windbreaker with a clipboard flagged him down. "Are you Mark Willis?" he asked, tone clipped and professional. Mark, confused but used to being affirmed, said yes. "This vehicle is being repossessed under directive of Colton and Son Enterprises," the man said, and pointed to the fine print on the lease agreement Mark hadn't read since he signed it 5 years ago. "You're welcome to gather your belongings before we drive it out." Mark's voice cracked into a protest, his hands shaking as he pointed toward the company building like it would shield him. "I work here," he exclaimed, as though proximity to the building proved ownership. The man remained impassive, already opening the driver's side door. "Not anymore, sir." Inside the office, Mark found the doors locked. The passcode he had entered 100 times now blinked red, his ID badge useless. The woman at the front desk, new and unfamiliar, peered at him with mild concern. "Sorry, I'm just following instructions," she said, then added, "Mr. Colton left a directive. You'll need to contact him directly." But there was no number, no paper trail, no voicemail left behind with apologies or negotiations. The only record he could find was a legal document left in his work drawer, a formal termination of his contract, citing breach of fiduciary trust and overreach of authority, signed and sealed, time-stamped, and fully within the bounds of legality. At home, Elise sat stunned on the edge of their pristine white sofa, the morning light falling across her untouched coffee. The insurance had been suspended and email had come through at 7:03 a.m., informing them that the group health plan had been withdrawn due to restructuring. It said their internet bill had bounced. The electric company called every piece of their carefully curated life their smart thermostat, their 2-car garage. Their vacation fund had all been built on scaffolding they didn't realize was never truly theirs. She looked at Mark and asked him the first honest question in years. Why would he do this? But Mark had no answer. He still believed, perhaps arrogantly, that the world owed him comfort just for standing in it. By nightfall, silence had engulfed their house. No streaming shows, no takeout, just the sound of their own breath, too loud in a house that once echoed with things they mistook for security. Elise tried to call me twice. Then she sent a message that was more emotional than I expected. "Dad, please, what's happening?" But I didn't answer. I sat on my porch, under a sky untouched by traffic or tension, sipping a hot cup of black tea while the last streaks of sunlight fell behind the hills. I had no desire for revenge, only for balance, for correction, for quiet, and I had finally found it. The late afternoon air had begun to cool, the sun drifting low behind the rows of tired storefronts that lined the road. From the industrial park to the modest cul-de-sac they called home, when Mark finally gave up waiting for a ride and began the slow walk home. The same man who once barked orders into a Bluetooth headset and revved the engine of a leased sedan, with performative confidence, now dragged his feet through broken sidewalks and fallen leaves, each step an admission of something he couldn't quite name. He walked past the gas station, where the clerk avoided eye contact as he bought a bottle of water, with crumpled bills, past the intersection where no one waved anymore, and past the car dealership where he had once posed proudly beside the SUV I co-signed years ago. That car, now gone, repossessed without warning, without so much as a phone call, had once been his badge of ascension. Now he walked, no headphones, no purpose, just the crunch of gravel and the rustle of wind filling the space where self-importance used to live. He didn't enter the house right away. He stood on the porch for several minutes, staring at the front door like it belonged to someone else, keys clenched in a hand that trembled more than he wanted to admit. When he finally entered, Elise was in the kitchen, frozen in place, holding a tablet with one hand while the other hovered above a pot she had forgotten to stir. The screen glowed with financial statements she hadn't opened in years. Documents I had quietly transferred back into my name, assets she thought were family property, but had always been mine, held in trust with signatures they had long since forgotten. The silence between them was thick, not angry but bewildered, like two people waking up from a shared illusion at the same time, unsure of who they were without the comfort of entitlement. Mark said nothing. He sat down at the dining table, his back slouched, eyes unfocused, the same table where, just days earlier, he had laughed loudly at vacation plans, had dismissed my presence as inconvenient, had joked that old men belonged in their place. That table, the silent witness to my humiliation, now bore the weight of his undoing. Elise placed the tablet down and leaned against the counter. She didn't ask where the car was or why the accounts were locked. She didn't need to. Everything that was happening had one source, and they both knew it. I wasn't there to see it, but I could imagine it as clearly as if I were. The way he slumped lower in his chair, the way she exhaled through her nose, long and sharp, the way neither of them dared speak my name out loud, as if invoking me might summon another collapse. What they didn't know, what they still couldn't fathom, was that I hadn't acted out of vengeance. I hadn't plotted or schemed with malice. No, this had been something quieter, more deliberate, a correction, a reminder that respect, once lost, demands a toll far greater than money. They had called me obsolete, treated me like a burden, forgotten the sacrifices I'd made when I was young and strong and their dreams were still half-formed. But I remembered every paper signed, every call made, every late-night loan that came with a smile instead of a ledger. I remembered because memory is all the old are allowed to keep when dignity is taken from them. That evening, while they sat together in stunned silence, I was already gone. The room I had occupied now stood empty, the bed neatly made, the closet bare. I hadn't told them when I left, and they hadn't noticed until it was far too late to ask why. My last act before walking out had been to turn off the lights, one switch at a time, like lowering the curtain on a play that had gone on too long. I hadn't left a note. There was nothing left to explain. It wasn't immediate. At first, there was only silent stays of it, a void that stretched long and wide, filled only by the soft rustle of leaves outside my new window and the chirp of birds who neither knew nor cared that I had disappeared from the house I once helped build. The world outside was slow here, honest, unbothered. But on the fourth morning, before sunrise, my old phone lit up with her name, a name I had once spoken with pride, with softness. Elise, I didn't answer. I let it ring until the sound became background noise and then vanished. But she called again 8 times before breakfast, 12 more by noon. I sat on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the steam rise and fade like the illusion she had built around herself. It wasn't until that evening, when her name appeared again with the small, shaking words, "Please, Dad," that I finally opened the line not to speak but to listen. And what I heard wasn't an apology. It wasn't understanding. It was panic. She didn't ask how I was. She asked what I did. Her voice, once sweet and strong, now cracked with disbelief as she listed the things missing from her world. The health insurance card that no longer worked when Mark tried to fill his prescription. The automatic payments that had stopped without warning. The car company refusing to release the vehicle at the impound lot. The shared business account that bounced to invoices in a single day. She was angry, not at herself, not at her husband, not at me. At the silence I had chosen over confrontation. At the quiet way I dismantled the life she thought belonged solely to them. I let her speak. I let every accusation fall like dry leaves on the porch. And when she finally ran out of breath, I asked her just one question. When he told me to go find my place, "What did you say?" The silence that followed was the truest sentence she'd ever spoken to me. Not a sound, not a whisper of defense or regret. She had let it happen. She had watched me shrink into the edges of her home, made cold by someone I once helped lift from obscurity, and said nothing. That's when I told her it was done. Not just the money, not just the accounts, done. There would be no undoing, no restitution. I had given her everything I had when she was young, my energy, my time, my name on her mortgage, my trust. And when I needed warmth, I got frostbite. Now she would learn what it meant to live without my umbrella. She begged. Her voice softened, turned childlike. She said she had been stressed, distracted, that she didn't realize how bad things had gotten. But the thing about respect is that it's not something you realize after the fact. It's a choice you make when the moment arrives. And she made hers over breakfast, when she stirred her coffee and said nothing while her husband humiliated her father in his pajamas. She asked where I was. I didn't tell her. Some things are earned, not given. Let her sit with that the way I sat with shame that morning, invisible at the table I once paid for. I hung up. She called again, left a voicemail filled with apologies and justifications stitched together like a makeshift blanket too thin for winter. I deleted it. That night, I sat by the fireplace in my small house with no television, no echoes of disappointment, only the warmth of a place untouched by ingratitude. I thought of her as a child, the way she used to run into my arms, the way she once looked at me like I was unshakable. That man died the moment she turned her back on him. Now, all that remained was an old man with clear eyes and steady hands. No longer willing to be used like a ladder, no longer afraid to walk away. Let her learn the cost of silence. Let her learn the cost of pride. The house was small, not much more than a rectangle of brick with 2 windows and a door that creaked slightly when the wind kissed it from the east. But it was mine, tucked away on a winding road where the trees arched overhead, like old friends leaning in for a quiet conversation. It stood far from the noise of entitlement, far from the weight of people who had once called me dad with love but later spat it out like it had a price tag. There were no voices here that demanded my silence, no footsteps that paused when I entered a room, no chairs pulled in closer to avoid the reach of a man made to feel like clutter. There was only stillness, and with it a new rhythm, slower, deliberate, almost sacred in its simplicity. I learned the creak of every board, the sound of wind against the eaves, the way the sun painted gold onto the floor at 5 in the afternoon. I cooked again, not out of obligation, but because the smell of garlic and butter reminded me of better times. I took long walks in the woods behind the house, listening to the birds converse without judgment. And sometimes I spoke back, not to be heard, but just to feel the shape of my own voice returning to me. It took time for the tremble to leave my hands, for the ache behind my ribs to settle into something manageable. The wound they left wasn't made of sharp things, it was dull and slow, like erosion. It wasn't the insult that broke me, it was the echo that followed. I had never asked to be celebrated, just not discarded. But now, away from their cold walls and colder hearts, I breathed easier. I didn't miss the car I had taken back. I didn't miss the home I had signed for but never truly belonged in. I missed the idea of them, the daughter I once held against my chest after she was born. The way she curled into me like I was the only thing in the world that could keep her safe. But that version of her had grown into someone who looked away when her husband told me I didn't belong. The child I raised would never have let that happen. The woman she became did. And that difference was enough to burn the bridge without regret. People in the town didn't ask questions. They saw an older man with tired eyes and a quiet smile, and that was enough. I helped at the local library on weekends, repaired a few broken benches near the lake, planted tomatoes in the dirt beside the porch. I had no ambition here, no need to build or climb or provide. I had already done all of that, poured decades into people who thanked me with absence. Now, I simply existed, and for the first time in years, that felt like enough. Every morning, I woke up without waiting for permission. I made my bed not because someone might judge it, but because I liked the look of order. I drank coffee out of a chipped mug and listened to the wind, to the soft groan of the trees leaning into each other like old men swapping secrets. Sometimes I got mail from Elise Short, clipped sentences that carried more desperation than apology. She wanted to visit, to talk, to explain. But words after damage are like rain on ruins. You can't rebuild what you've let fall for too long. I didn't reply. I kept her letters in a drawer with no lock, not out of sentiment, but because I wanted to remind myself what it sounded like when love begged instead of offered. I found joy in odd places, a chair that didn't rock but creaked in just the right way, the neighbor's dog who sat by my porch waiting for a treat, a book I had read 20 years ago that still made me cry in the same chapter. I wasn't healing towards something. I was simply healing away. Every day was a step further from the man who waited for scraps at his own kitchen table, who flinched when laughter erupted without him, who apologized just for asking to exist. That man was gone. In his place stood someone older, lonelier perhaps, but intact in ways that truly mattered. My back still ached. My knees still reminded me of the ladder I fell from in '93. But my dignity, my God, my dignity had never stood taller. There were nights I dreamed of them not with rage, but with a kind of fading sorrow. In those dreams, Elise was a child again, and I was whole, and Mark did not exist. But dreams are mercy wrapped in lies, and I woke from them each time with the sharp edge of truth. I didn't look back, not because I had nothing to return to, but because looking back implies something might still be there. What they burned wasn't just a relationship, it was the foundation. I had laid brick by brick in silence while they built their lives on top of it. When they pulled it out from under me, they thought I would fall. But I had already built something deeper, something invisible to those who measure worth in title deeds and dinner invitations. I built resilience, and it carried me here, to this quiet place where nothing extraordinary happens. And that's the miracle. No one yells. No one points to the door and tells me I don't belong. I sit in my chair, drink my coffee, listen to the world hum around me. I have no empire. I have no applause, but I have peace. And for a man who was once told to go to his place, I have never been more exactly where I belong. The envelope was unmarked save for his name, written in my own slow handmark. No title, no warmth, no acknowledgement of what he had once pretended to be. I mailed it from a town to counties over, not out of caution but because I didn't want the return address to taint this place I now called home. The contents were almost non-existent. A single birthday card, blank inside, no sentiment scrawled across the fold, no blessing, no wish, no barb disguised as politeness, just absence measured, deliberate, whole. I imagined him opening it with the same smugness he wore on his face the day he told me to leave, the same hollow pride that mistook cruelty for authority. I imagined the confusion spreading first, his eyes scanning the blank paper, as if a message had been written in invisible ink, as if his importance guaranteed a second page, a follow-up, a clue. But there was nothing, no explanation, no rant, no closure, because closure is a gift, and I had already given him far too much. He would show it to my daughter. I was sure. He would hold it like a riddle, like an accusation, and she would read the silence, as if she could extract some last thread of connection from it. But there was nothing left to unravel. Silence, I had learned, was not passive. It was sharp. It was exact. And when you've been ignored, dismissed, pushed to the edges of your own life by people who only noticed your presence when it served them, silence becomes the loudest scream. It fills the room, sits at the dinner table, follows them into sleep. They would try to make sense of it. They would wonder if it meant forgiveness or perhaps a final surrender. But I had long stopped playing their games. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't war. It was finality, not of emotion but of expectation. I expected nothing now, and that was the deepest sentence I could ever deliver. In the days that followed, I found myself returning to the memory of that first morning in their house. The way the chair I sat on seemed just slightly pulled back from the table. How the coffee was poured after theirs. How the laughter didn't pause when I entered the room. It had all begun with such small fractures. I used to tell myself they didn't notice, that their neglect was unconscious. But the truth was far less poetic. They noticed. They simply didn't care. They had outgrown me, not with maturity, but with convenience. I had become a relic, an obligation, a pause in their schedule. And when I asked for space, not forever, just a space to heal their hurt burden. So I left, and took every silent sacrifice with me. Every dime, every signature, every document they didn't bother to read but gladly benefited from. I took back my name from the bottom of their comforts, and in return, I gave them silence. Sometimes, when the sky over my new home bruises purple before it darkens into night, I sit on the porch and imagine him at his birthday dinner. Perhaps it's smaller this year. Perhaps he sits across from my daughter and avoids looking at the empty seat, the one that used to be filled by someone who signed the loan for their dining table, who helped cover the down payment for the house they now argue in. I wonder if the card is still there, unopened again, passed around like a ghost. Or perhaps it sits in a drawer, forgotten but too strange to throw away. Maybe, in his quieter moments, if he has them, he understands. Maybe he remembers the way I looked that morning when he told me to go to my place, not with anger, but with something that felt like breaking. Maybe he realizes now that I went, and this silence is that place. I have no desire to haunt them. This was never revenge in the dramatic sense. I didn't scream. I didn't slam doors. I simply vanished, like mist lifting from a road after sunrise there, and then not. I never expected an apology, and if it came now, it would be too late. Not because I'm bitter, but because I'm finished. My dignity is not up for negotiation, and my worth is no longer a conversation. I live surrounded by quiet, but I am not lonely. There's a difference. Loneliness is being forgotten in a room full of people who should love you. Solitude is choosing a space where you are not reduced. I walk into town some days, nodding at the same clerk who now remembers my name, who asks if I'll be buying the usual bread. I talk to the librarian about old westerns, fix the occasional broken shelf at the church, and not once does anyone ask what I did to be abandoned. Because here, no one assumes the worst of you just for needing help. The card I sent wasn't about making him feel small. That would imply he was still large in my life. It wasn't a punishment. It was punctuation. A period, sharp and definitive. It was a way of telling them, all my daughter included, that the bridge had been walked one too many times, and its planks had cracked under the weight of unspoken disrespect. I didn't burn it. I simply stopped crossing it. They could stand on their side, wonder, whisper, dissect. I would stand on mine, whole. And when I received no reply, and I never truly expected one, I didn't check the mailbox twice. I didn't wait for a knock. I simply brewed tea, fed the neighbor's cat when he wandered over, and watched the leaves change with the slow grace of someone who no longer has to pretend. If there's a lesson in all this, I don't preach it. I live it quietly, with purpose. I do not chase love anymore. I do not offer explanations to people who never listened. I do not lower my voice to be allowed a seat. I build my own table, under trees that do not judge, in a house with no echoes of old betrayals. And every night, I sleep without needing to be forgiven, because I did not fail them. They failed the moment they mistook my generosity for obligation, and my patience for weakness. So now, the card sits with them, blank, but loud, and I sit here, in a silence that no longer hurts only, heals,